власть. В чем заключается сущность этой новой власти?
Cinema was still in its infancy when Lenin took power, but he already understood how important it was to strengthen support for his regime, admitting that, of all the arts, the most important for us is the cinema. However, he wasn't a film fanatic like some of his successors, viewing cinema more as a strategic tool. That's why he liked newsreels and early agitational propaganda films called agitki. But that doesn't mean that he was contrary to simple entertainment or foreign films. Lenin himself definitely saw early Western films when he was in exile in Europe before the revolution. There is no information on which of these he especially liked, but I think there's a high chance he might have seen Jude X, an incredibly popular French serial from 1916. Based on his political views, I think he could have liked it, because it's about a vigilante taking revenge on a rich banker who bankrupted the young man's family. Lenin also had a good relationship with early Soviet filmmaker Dziga Vertov, whose work played an important role for the spread of communist propaganda and influenced the future of global cinema because of his pioneering editing techniques and documentaries. There are many newsreels and documentaries from Vertov that Lenin might have enjoyed, but Anniversary of the Revolution was one of the most successful ones. It was screened on trains all over the country in the early days of the Russian Civil War, because that's how most of these films were shown to the general public back in the day. Vertov also made some of the first ever Soviet cartoons, a medium that Lenin personally saw a great future in, and enjoyed Vertov's satirical cartoons like Today, unfortunately a lost film. If you want to get a better idea of what his animation looked like, you can watch Soviet Toys instead, which is still available online. And finally, I want to include one of the only movies that Lenin explicitly praised, The Miracle Maker, which funnily enough wasn't just heroic propaganda, but a good old communist comedy.
Соотечественники и соотечественницы, наступил великий день победы над Германией.
Stalin was, without a doubt, the most avid cinephile of all the Soviet leaders. He had a home cinema in every single one of his residencies, of which he used the Kremlin one most frequently. He didn't watch movies alone like your average cinephile. Instead, he liked to watch them with the boys, his inner circle, members of which were future Soviet leaders Georgy Malenkov and Nikita Khrushchev, who we'll talk about later. While the Soviet people could only watch movies that fit Stalin's vision of proper communist cinema, he liked his personal viewing diet to include heaps of foreign films. While he publicly criticized most of them, some of his favorites trickled down to regular people like Tarzan and Stagecoach. The movies that stayed in his personal collection were never dubbed, so that nobody would ever find out that he had his own stash of foreign films, so they had to be translated live during his private screenings. That was Ivan Bolshakov's role as Minister of Cinematography. The only small problem was that he didn't speak a single foreign language, so real translators would give him the translated dialogue and he would learn it by heart. But Stalin wasn't content being just a passive viewer. He wanted to be an active participant in the production of Soviet cinema. He supervised as many films as he could, and sometimes was even personally involved in a quote-unquote consultation with the filmmakers. He always told them that they were free to take or ignore his suggestions. He was only there to help. But those who wanted to live weren't fooled so easily. One of those filmmakers was Sergei Eisenstein, and his film Ivan the Terrible was amongst Stalin's favorites. He admired the Tsar and thought the film represented him with the dignity he deserved. But he didn't think the same about the sequel, where Ivan the Terrible goes absolutely crazy. For Stalin, it hit a bit too close to home, and I'm surprised he didn't execute Eisenstein for it, instead summoning him for a thorough scolding and rewriting session. The next movie Stalin couldn't live without was definitely Chapayev, about a Soviet hero of the Civil War, which he watched no less than 38 times, and it did tremendously at the box office. I also need to include a foreign film on this list, which I think should be Tarzan the Ape Man, but you could easily include the whole series. In his own words, the film is about a man that escapes the horrors of the capitalist world by fleeing to the jungle, where he finds freedom and happiness. And now comes his favorite film, the musical comedy Volga Volga, which he rewatched endlessly and knew the dialogue and songs by heart. No matter how much he liked it though, apparently he was so shocked by a kiss in a scene before it was censored that for a while all kissing was banned in Soviet films.
Послевоенные годы были годами крупных достижений в промышленности и на транспорте, в сельском хозяйстве.
Nobody has ever heard of Georgy Malenkov, but he briefly was leader of the Soviet Union at the chaotic time after Stalin's death. If you saw the death of Stalin from a few years ago, you might remember that there were several contenders for Stalin's successor from members of his inner circle, out of which Khrushchev ultimately came out on top. All we know about Malenkov's personal viewing habits is that he was often present at Stalin's private screenings. But according to his son Andrei, Malenkov also watched films with his family on Saturday evenings. Apart from Soviet classics, he also enjoyed British films, because interestingly enough, Malenkov was fascinated by British culture. But unfortunately, I didn't find any specific titles that he liked, and there are too many films that fit his criteria, so I'm gonna have to leave it at that.
Империалисты, которые здесь выступали, они не доросли до уровня общечеловеческого понимания свободы.
Under Khrushchev's leadership, Soviet art and cinema finally started to recover. He condemned the crazy cult-like aspects of Stalin's regime, and censorship was relaxed just a little, but enough to allow an outpouring of timeless classics like The Cranes Are Flying, which was the first and only Soviet film to win at Cannes Film Festival. Many acclaimed filmmakers also emerged in this era, including Leonid Gaidai, Elem Klimov, and Andrei Tarkovsky. Khrushchev was supportive of this new wave in Soviet cinema, which wasn't about perfect communist heroes like Chapayev, but about regular people caught up in situations far beyond their control, with all their flaws and struggles. You can definitely see it by how war films changed during this time. Combat is in the background, and instead its effects on people are the focus. Among these films, we know that Ballad of a Soldier was a movie Khrushchev really enjoyed and even helped overcome censorship. And it's a story about a young soldier trying to visit his mother before returning to the front line. Then a film about the Battle of Stalingrad called They Fought for Their Motherland was one that Khrushchev liked so much that he even recommended it to Americans when he visited the United States. But he was also keen on having fun and appreciated satire like Welcome or No Trespassing, made by Elem Klimov, famous for his anti-war masterpiece Come and See in the 80s. During Khrushchev's regime, a limited amount of foreign films was also imported for the Soviet public to enjoy, many of which were Indian. The USSR and India were getting along great at the time, and Indian films, especially those from Bollywood, were all the rage in the Soviet Union. Their escapist quality was unlike anything the Soviet people ever saw before. Even if there aren't definitive sources on whether Khrushchev saw Aurora, I think he would have enjoyed it because of the class struggle at the center of the story.
Дорогие друзья,
The only Soviet leader who could truly rival Stalin's appetite for films is Brezhnev. He was crazy about westerns and watched them all the time, even if, of course, most of them weren't available for the general public. He especially loved Chuck Connor's films, an American actor who appeared in many westerns including the TV series The Rifleman. Brezhnev even met his hero when he visited the United States. He also liked so-called Soviet westerns, which generally took place during the Civil War period of the USSR in remote parts of Central Asia. One of the most revered classics from this genre is White Son of the Desert, which wouldn't have been released at all if Brezhnev hadn't seen it by accident. It happened when his staff didn't have any new westerns to show him, so they thought that White Son of the Desert would do. And they were damn right. During Brezhnev's regime, censorship in art and cinema was tightened. But Soviet filmmakers still produced a ton of classics that Russian speakers still remember fondly to this day, especially comedies like Diamond Arm. There was also a more dramatic film called Belarusian Station, about 4 Soviet veterans reuniting 25 years after World War II, which even got Brezhnev to cry. Finally, knowing Brezhnev's taste for westerns, he would definitely have chosen the first Soviet action film among his favorites, Pirates of the 20th Century, which censors didn't like until they found out that their dear leader actually loved it.
Я воспринимаю как доверие к нашей ленинской коммунистической партии, членом которой я состою более 40 лет.
Andropov was head of the KGB in Brezhnev's time in power, and as such, he was very fond of the organization. Naturally, he wanted to project a positive image of the KGB to the general public, and he was personally involved in this mission. A Russian spy novel called No Password Required by Yulian Semyonov became very popular at the time, where a character called Maxim Isaev made his first appearance. His story was expanded at what became the most successful spy thriller series ever created in the Soviet Union, 17 Moments of Spring. Maxim Isaev poses as Max Otto von Sturlitz, a Soviet spy posing as an SS officer to destroy the Third Reich from within. And his story kept everybody in the Soviet Union hooked to their TV screens whenever new episodes came out, even Brezhnev. It was one of the greatest PR successes for the KGB. There were many more series and films of this kind coming out in the Soviet Union after that, including The Shield and the Sword, also a great success. A much older film called Secret Agent from 1947 had to be among Andropov's favorites. I have no way of knowing for sure if he saw it, but it was the first spy film ever made in the USSR and it heavily influenced 17 Moments of Spring. Finally, I have a bit of a wild card. During Brezhnev's regime, a popular TV series about Sherlock Holmes emerged and continued to be popular under Andropov, which was even praised internationally for its adaptation of the original source material. It's not exactly a spy thriller, but Sherlock Holmes fits well among Andropov's other favorites.
Необходимым условием дальнейшего повышения материального благосостояния народа, роста и эффективности всего народного хозяйства страны.
Just like Malenkov, Chernenko didn't have a huge influence as a ruler because of how little time he spent on the job, dying barely a year after starting. Both he and Andropov pretty much continued what Brezhnev was up to, not doing much to improve the USSR's economy and stale bureaucratic structure. But Soviet cinema was undeterred, producing many classics that tackled social issues in an increasingly critical and explicit way, like Flights in Dreams and Reality and Scarecrow. Chernenko was Brezhnev's buddy ever since they met in Moldova, where Chernenko was chief propagandist for a decade. When Brezhnev went to Moscow, Chernenko followed him and probably enjoyed many screenings at his private cinema. Not much is known about his viewing preferences, but since he was an experienced propagandist, he definitely had a clear idea of what made great Soviet cinema. He expressed his displeasure of quote-unquote loose and whining or God-seeking characters. He thought that films should exalt communist heroes, and those that didn't follow communist ideology should be, in his own words, stamped out resolutely. But he never mentioned any examples. Most of his career he spent as the quiet bureaucrat behind the scenes, and it's fitting for him to be that kind of apathetic viewer too. He probably just stopped watching films after Brezhnev's death.
Я прекращаю свою деятельность на посту президента СССР.
The last Soviet leader Gorbachev was very fond of cinema, so much so that after the collapse of the USSR he even lent his acting abilities to Wim Wenders' sequel of Wings and Desire and an infamous commercial for Pizza Hut. He also appeared in several documentaries, including one by Werner Herzog. During his leadership, Gorbachev helped several films pass the censors, including Ossa, featuring Viktor Tsoi, famous lead singer of Russian rock band Kino, Repentance, a Georgian critique of Stalin, and the post-apocalyptic film Dead Man's Letters. None of these films would have seen the light of day even a few years before Gorbachev's time in power. More foreign films were also imported into the country than ever before, some legally while others illegally on bootleg VHS tapes. I'm sure Gorbachev saw a lot of foreign films over the years, as these pictures with Hollywood actors and filmmakers might suggest. But the final movie that I'd like to include in his 4 favorites is one that he himself claimed was one of the best he ever saw, the Russian World War II prison escape movie, Our Own. That's it, 4 favorites for every Soviet leader. Well, almost. I know some of them were just my guesses, and some of the leaders that were more transitional didn't provide much material for me to work with. But I hope you still found some cool recommendations to put on your endless watch list. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.